Brings back memories of preaching to my phone in the sanctuary during COVID, if that was not the weirdest thing in the world. So anyway, tonight I want to just begin to raise the question about where is God when the innocent suffer? Because I think that's one of the most difficult questions that we wrestle with as people of faith. The people ask, how can a loving God let the innocent suffer in the way that they do? And some people come to the conclusion that either God doesn't care, God is indifferent, or God is impotent. God can't do anything about it. So what's the Christian response to the suffering of the innocent? And where I want to begin is with one of the most awful stories that I've ever read, but it's a true story, and it gets at the heart of what I think is the Christian witness. And it actually comes from Elie Wiesel, who, as many of you know, was a survivor of the Holocaust, a Jewish writer, who in his book Night described one of the experiences in Auschwitz. And the story goes that there were two men and a boy who escaped Auschwitz. The guards went out, captured them, brought them back. The next day, at dawn, they had everyone line up in the commons courtyard area around a gallows and put nooses around the necks of these two men and this boy. Dropped at the floor. The two men died instantly, but the boy didn't because he didn't weigh enough. And it took him a long, long time to die. And Wiesel said there was a person behind him who said, in disgust, "Where is God?" And the same person said the same thing several minutes later. "Where is God?" And Wiesel said, "I heard a voice within me say, 'Where is God?' God is there on the gallows." That answer, God on the gallows, is really, I think, the Christian answer to the question of where is God when the innocent suffer. Because at the heart of our faith is innocent suffering. That on the cross, the person who was most innocent of all, of any person who's ever lived, never did anything wrong, suffered more than anyone else. Because on the cross, it wasn't just the physical suffering, but it was the mental, the emotional, and taking upon himself the sin of the whole world. So where is God when the innocent suffering? He's where he was on that first Good Friday, with those who suffer. We believe in a God on the gallows, a Christ on the cross. That God is always with us, not just in the heights, but in the depths, not just on the bright days, but on the darkest days, not just in moments of joy, but in moments of our deepest despair. Because remember what Jesus prayed from the cross? my God, why have you forsaken me?" This cry of despair. And so we find God in the depths, in the darkness, suffering with us. I think that means two things, at least two things. One is that we cannot put an equal sign between sin and suffering, which some people try and do. That the more a person sins, the more they suffer. And the cross puts an end to that. Because here's the person who did not sin at all, who suffered more than any. So no one can ever make that equation if you believe in a God of the gallows, a God on the cross. Secondly, I think it tells us that when the innocent suffer, God is not the one who inflicts the suffering. God is the one who bears the suffering. God is not the crucifier. God is the crucified. God is not the slayer. God is the lamb who was slain. God is not the victimizer. God is the victim. God is not the torturer. God is the tortured. And so the Lord does not afflict us with death and sickness and disease as some sort of punishment, as some sort of evening the score, as some sort of test. We just have to get that whole theology out of our heads completely. That is bad theology, that somehow God is out to even the score, God is out to punish us for the bad things we did. There's just nothing in the Gospels, nothing in the New Testament that would tell us that. So wherever it comes from, it does not come from Jesus, and it does not come from the New Testament. We just need to just banish that kind of theology for good. I think the other thing that it tells us is that I am never alone in my suffering. No matter how deep it is, no matter how dark things seem, no matter how painful, I'm not alone. That Christ is always with me in that suffering, and he knows it from the inside. Because if he bore the sin and the shame and the suffering of the whole world, he knows my suffering from the inside. He knows it better than I do. And so I am never alone. Even if nobody else around me can fully understand that, he knows. And so he is always with me in the depths. I want to just give you a story. I could tell any number of stories about how that conviction that God is with us in the depths has certainly allowed me as a pastor to show up in some pretty dark situations and to be able to say, the Lord is with us right here, right now, that he is present amongst us at the funeral home, at the graveside, in the intensive care unit, wherever we find ourselves. So this story comes from many, many years ago when I was a student chaplain at United Hospital in St. Paul. And I was there 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I was working on the oncology unit for most of that year. And after I'd been there a while, the charge nurse said to me, we have a young woman here on the unit who is in her early 20s. She said she grew up Lutheran, and the doctors diagnosed her with this blood cancer, very rare, very difficult to treat. There's really not much they can do. They're trying what they can, but they're not optimistic. We're wondering if you'd be willing to visit her. And she said, you may not get a really warm reception because she is really angry. Okay. So I walked into the room and stood at the door, and she was sitting on the bed, and she had her legs crossed as she was sitting on the bed. Her skin was very pale. She had her eyes were pretty sunken, and she was very thin. I mean, frankly, it reminded me almost of some of the pictures of what you've seen of the Holocaust survivors, just so thin. And she was smoking a cigarette, and she was looking out the window the opposite way. So I stood there for a moment, and then I said, good morning. And she turned and she looked at me, and I had on my clerical collar because it just made sense in the hospital to have on your clerical collar so people knew you were a chaplain. And so she knew right away that I was clergy. And she gave me the death stare. I mean, if it were real, I would have been dead on the spot. You know, it's like, what in the world are you doing here, you know? And I said, can I come in? She stared at me for quite a long while, looked outside the window for another while, then turned back to me and said, I guess so. So I pulled up a chair and sat down. And she didn't say anything for a long time, and I didn't either. And then she turned to me and she said, "This is hell." And I said, "I'll bet it is. Tell me, what's hellish about it?" And so she began to tell me about the chemo and about the radiation and about nausea and about losing her hair and about how none of her friends seemed to want to come and visit her, about it was hard for her family to come because there were some family dynamics, family conflict, and how alone she felt. And so she just described what this experience had been like. And then she said, "Is God punishing me?" I said, we'll call her Debbie. "Debbie, God doesn't work that way. Why would you think God is punishing me?" She went on to say that she didn't grow up in the best of homes, and so she dropped out of high school. She had done all kinds of drugs. She had slept around a lot. So she wondered if God was punishing her for the way that she had lived her life. And I told her no, and told her the story of the prodigal son, about how he went to the far country and squandered his inheritance in loose living and wound up down in the pigsty, which for a Jewish person was the lowest of the low, and how he had come back and his father had welcomed him. She didn't know the story, although she had gone to Sunday school in a Lutheran church as a little kid, but knew very little about scripture and so forth. So she didn't know that story. And she said, "Is that really true?" I said, "Yeah, it really is." And I said, "Debbie, God loves you just the way you are." And she said, "Really?" "Yeah." And I said, he's here with you through this whole thing." "Really?" I said, yeah, really. And so she began to ask questions, and we talked more about what God is like, and it was probably a couple hours I was in there. And I said, "I need to go here shortly, but can I pray with you?" And she said, "Yeah." And so I prayed for her, for God to bless her in every way and be with her through all this. And then I said, "Can I come back?" And she said, "Yeah." So I came back the next Tuesday and Thursday, and she asked, "How do you pray?" So I talked about how you pray, and she kind of remembered the Lord's Prayer from growing up, and so we talked about prayer, and I said, "You know, you can read the Bible, but I'd start with the Gospel of Luke. Don't start at the beginning, start with the Gospel of Luke." And I made sure she had a Bible. And so every day that I was there, we'd visit for probably a good hour and talk about faith, and then what's heaven like, and all those sorts of things that surround you when you're dying. And I'd love to say that the doctors found this miracle drug and she made it through, but the truth is, she died about 3 weeks later. I was not there that day. The nurses told me about it when I came the next time. I wish I had been there, but I wasn't. But being able to tell someone from the bottom of your heart that God is with you in this situation here and now, because the God we know and love is a God who is the God on the cross, the God on the gallows, to me is one of the most profound and important things in our faith. It doesn't answer all the questions about why. It's not a magic wand that makes everything wonderful. But to know that God is with you in the depths is, I think, one of the most important things we can offer in those moments. It's one of the reasons I'm Lutheran. Martin Luther talked about the crucified God, and that to me is at the heart of my faith, is to believe in a God the creator of the whole universe, who was not only born in a manger, but went to the cross for us and then rose from the dead, is a profound and significant thing. So, I'm going to give you a few questions that you can use to talk about, or whatever, don't feel like you have to answer this. This is just to get the wheels turning. So, what do you think, what do you feel about the story from Elie Wiesel? I think is one thing. What do you think about the description that Martin Luther has of Jesus as a crucified God? What do you think about that? What do you think about, what do you feel when you think of Jesus as the innocent sufferer, as the one who was most innocent, perfectly innocent, and yet suffered the most? And have you had those experiences of Christ being with you in the depths and in the darkness? What were they like? Or someone you know and love? What has been your experience with that? Okay.